At the end of last year, I checked out the Apple TV 4K, and mostly I was interested in the Apple Arcade service, and I figured this was almost like a little mini Apple console that I could use to check out their selection. And for the most part, I thought it was an okay service. They had some games in there that were decent and at times pretty good, and there were no microtransactions attached at all to those games that, yes, are in a subscription service. But something I mentioned was I would double back to the Apple TV 4K if the emulation scene around it evolved a bit, and actually it has. In fact, this has been updated about every month or so since the summertime. And I figured today we would take a look at why, believe it or not, this little Apple TV 4K is sort of a mini emulation beast. But there is one hang up right now that I think is stopping it from reaching its full potential. We'll go over all of that here today. So if you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. All right, here we are. This is the Apple TV 4K. This is the home screen here. Today we're taking a look at Retroarch, which is fully downloadable. So you can go to the App Store here. You can search for it, install it. It's all done very, very easily here. You're not going off to a website, downloading it, doing all kinds of weird side loading. It's official. When I go into Retroarch here, we can load in. It does go over how you get the files here, which it's pretty clever because if you think about it on the Apple TV, you can't just say drop a USB stick, anything, connect it, and good to go. You would actually transfer it over your network. So they give you a URL, or in this case, we see an address to go to. And it's pretty easy. You just drag and drop stuff there. It's a little file browser in your web browser, and you can move stuff over, at which point you can then use Retroarch to scan the directories and load everything up. That, along with your BIOS files. And I mean, can we just take a moment to appreciate here the cross media bar interface that Retroarch has? I set all this up. Like when you get in here, it won't necessarily look this way, but there are many tutorials you can take a look at, and in about 5 minutes, you can have this nice, clean PS3 looking interface, which works really well on a TV. So, I mean, you can kind of envision this up on a larger screen in your living room, and I don't think it looks out of place. If I start from the left to right, we have basic settings, user interface, favorites, and then we get into what obviously people care about, which are the games. So I set up a bunch of different categories here. Okay, you can see the controllers at the top. It makes it very, very easy to get around and pick out what you want to play. I have, just from the top here, I have the Game Boy Advance. We'll get back to GameCube, but I do have a GameCube here technically. Nintendo 64, DS, PlayStation 1, PSP, and then PSP again, but it saw these files as like PlayStation Network files, so it put it in its own category here. But what's really nice is Retroarch will go through and it'll download, as you can see on the right side, box art for everything. So it's pretty easy to kind of dress it up at least a little bit here. I like the icons at the top being the controllers, and you can also page through and see some screenshots and stuff here. So I'm just loading up Game Boy Advance right out of the gate here. This is pretty straightforward for, I would say, most systems now to run. Game Boy Advance, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis. Those aren't exactly like the hardest things technically, but yes, if you're curious, Game Boy Advance games run fine. Most of the games that I have on here right now are Nintendo titles, and if you've been at least somewhat aware of the scene currently, not a good idea to run anything with Mario specifically. Pokemon still seems to be this weird gray area, but definitely nothing like Mario related. You'll get dinged pretty quick for your video. Now I am using the Xbox Series controller, but for the most part, any Bluetooth controller will sync up and work. Like I've used the 8-bit Do controller, I've used the DualSense controller. I haven't tried hooking up the Switch Pro controller, but for the most part, a vast majority of Bluetooth controllers will work without any issues. You can navigate around the menu for the Apple TV, and then of course when you get in the Retroarch, it should pick it up if it's a well-known controller. Okay, N64 is up next. I did play around with the resolution. As you can see, it's kind of like it is technically widescreen here, and they try to accommodate that the best they can with it. But I have noticed that when you do that, as you're seeing, the frame rate does drop, although if you've played N64, you're pretty used to some low frame rates. However, you do have graphical glitches and stuff here, and Nintendo 64 has always been kind of hit or miss, depending on the emulator you use, the settings you have in terms of hardware. So whenever I go into testing for it, I kind of just cross my fingers and hope, and I mean, technically it is running. This would be one that if there was more interest or support, say in like the tvOS or iOS, that I could see this one in particular actually doing pretty well. Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, those always tended to be a bit, I don't say tough, but harder. Banjo-Tooie, definitely. That one would always kind of beat up emulators or the N64 itself. But yeah, other than some of the weird graphical glitches and stuff, even as you're seeing here, which this is a 720p image that I've upscaled it to here with the emulator, it runs roughly around that 30 FPS mark in this opening area Kazooie. Moving over to PS1, I have Spyro Ripto's Rage up, and it runs really well, kind of as you'd expect when I have the native resolution in what I would call crunchy mode. Now it's just 1x, just standard native, and you can see Spyro looks quite crunchy, but you do have the option to go in here and we can play around with the video settings. So we can move that up. We'll just say to like 4x. There we go. And we'll go to resume. And there you go. No more crunch. Although, you know what? I think it sounds funny because this does look cleaner. I kind of prefer like the native resolution, internal resolution that we just had in front of us. I think there is something to it. It might be that nostalgic bit, obviously, from this generation where it was early 3D days. Like, we all know that. And look, that doesn't necessarily work for everything, which we'll talk about PSP here in a bit, where I don't think this applies, like the nostalgia stuff like this. But there's something about the crunchy nature of that generation when it came to 3D that I actually think still holds up now. But yeah, you could make your PS1 games look real clean, even on like the Apple TV here. But I don't know. Do you want to? Yeah, I guess it's up to you. Yeah, I guess Gran Turismo does benefit from this. I mean, it's mostly cars. You don't have like characters technically on screen, and cars do benefit from just a smoother look like this when you up the resolution. Which it is funny. I mean, Gran Turismo. Granted, we see what car games look like now. It still has a nice look to it. Okay, from the PS1 days. And the thing with this, though, with the Apple TV, the PS1 emulation is it's pretty good. It is. It holds pretty much good frame rate across the board, even when you pump up the resolution like this if you want to. And if you don't, you want to keep that native resolution, you're pretty much going to have good experiences all the way around. You do still have some like weird graphical glitches at times, where there's lines in the screen that'll pop up maybe during a cutscene or something. But for the most part, I would say it's pretty clean all the way around. But this is where the Apple TV has impressed me, and that's with PlayStation Portable emulation, which I've noticed can be kind of touch and go. All right, so some systems handle it better than others. Lower power systems, I've noticed, do tend to struggle with the PSP, especially if you try to boost resolution like I have here, where I have moved this up, I think, 3 or 4x in terms of its resolution. You can kind of see it just on Kratos here, just how much smoother overall it looks, because when you blow up a PSP image, it doesn't exactly translate over well. Like, for example, here you can see the cutscene here that is like pre-rendered and done and everything. All that aliasing and stuff, that's typically how his normal model would look in-game, like we saw there with the title screen. So here we are getting into the gameplay, and there's a lot of effects. As you can see, rain's falling, there's lightning. I've seen this multiple times where a system will start playing it, and then it will just tank in terms of frame rate. So when I saw this, I was like, okay, wow, I mean, I know it's a PSP being emulated, but trying to boost its resolution and do all these other things, it's actually pretty impressive for a lower power device like this. It is running the A15 Bionic chip, which, I mean, on its own is not a bad chip or anything, but it's not like a ultra powerful chip in like the landscape of processors and GPUs. So the PSP actually doing this well is really, really cool to see live. I will say certain PSP games clean up better than others. Some just don't look great when they get cleaned up. I mean, this is God of War on the PSP. It looked good already. It's a little smaller screen, but when you can raise the resolution, you can apply settings to get rid of aliasing and stuff, it looks legitimately good. Got some Burnout going here, which is a game on the PSP that does clean up nicely here when you bump the resolution up. I remember being so impressed by this game back in the day on the PSP handheld, because it was like, oh wow, it's an actual like 3D racing game. Remember, up until this point, we were mostly dealing with Game Boy Advance, where they did their best to try to simulate 3D on it. It wasn't anything like this. I mean, this was like a next gen leap in the handheld space when we got that PSP. And the DS was cool because of the 2 screens, but like PSP was such a powerhouse in the space at the time. But like you could see how well it ages when you clean it up like this with the resolution. And again, I've been pretty impressed with just the Apple TV, even higher frame rate games like these. It does pretty well. That frame rate count at the top, by the way, does not refresh constantly. I've noticed this as I've checked this out. It seems to update slowly, so it still holds pretty well in person here. Definitely higher than what I had with the PSP. Back in the day, but it definitely hovers closer to like that 60 FPS mark all the way around. The DS also works on this system. It's a little awkward though, as you can imagine, since, well, there's a touchscreen involved and you don't have access to one here. So let me jump into a game that Nintendo won't kill me over. All right, here we are. We're playing Tony Hawk. Now, first of all, I know it's decades late at this point, but man, shout out to Vicarious Vision. They got Tony Hawk on the DS like this. It's crazy stuff. So as you just saw, you can jump between side by side or like one on top of the other. I actually keep it side by side like this. I kind of feel like I get more screen real estate. It feels like on a widescreen monitor or just a widescreen display in general. But if you've never played this before, it was a full-fledged Tony Hawk game on the DS, which is, look, the DS wasn't like a weak system technically, but it was, by today's standards, you look back on it and you're like, wow, how'd they do that? Vicarious Visions, man, they're talented studio. But as you can see, you do have, the full array of the DS along with its touchscreen. So how do we do that? Well, in this instance, the core they have here on Retroarch, you do have the little dot. See the little dot? You actually use in this case, the right stick I'm using right now on the Xbox controller, and you click it in to touch. So I can like freeze time kind of and do that. And then when you fall down, you also have the ability to get angry and like start breaking stuff, which is funny. But I've pretty much just left the visuals here in kind of this crunchy state. I haven't played around with the video settings or anything much for the DS in particular, but I think it's mostly been the bottom screen that's kind of put me off, and the fact that, let's face it, the games that most people want to play on this are going to be things like Pokemon, which I will tell you, they do run fine. So if you want to, I guess, use the emulator for that, you can. But it's not something that's going to be up on YouTube as much anymore just because of Nintendo's policies. So yeah, it's unfortunate there. However, Tony Hawk's still awesome. Everything pretty much runs well from what I've seen. It's going to be harder in certain games. So like Phantom Hourglass, not going to be great because you would then be using the right stick. You would have to load, there is a patch that removes the need for a stylus from my member. You want to load that up because otherwise you're just going to be doing this the whole time and clicking and holding, and it would be extremely uncomfortable. But yeah, DS emulation is a full go on the Apple TV, provided the touchscreen is something you can get over or figure out based on the game you're playing. You'll have a pretty good experience all the way around on it. So all of that actually seems pretty awesome. What's the hang-up exactly? Well, I've pretty much shown you the extent of what that Apple 4K TV can do at this time. And you might be wondering, well, hold on. Where's the GameCube? Where's the PS2? Where's the Dreamcast? Well, that actually comes down to software, not necessarily the hardware. See, for me at this time, the hardware is still kind of undecided around it handling some of those more advanced systems, mostly because Apple has a bit of a roadblock right now, and it's been described and explained by people much smarter than me when it comes to software development of emulators, and this apparently comes back to something called just-in-time compiling, or JIT. Because it cannot compile in real time, it is a pretty serious issue when it comes to some of these more advanced systems, to where it's just going to be laggy. The issue now is everyone is looking to Apple potentially to loosen the reins a bit when it comes to the ability to do this just-in-time compiling officially, because you can sideload stuff and you can jailbreak stuff, not really with this Apple 4K TV, but that has existed in the past. Here, though, people who are developing these emulators and stuff keep talking about Apple hopefully allowing JIT compiling at some point. And since we have been seeing Apple get pushed a bit more when it comes to just regulation in general and how much of a closed grip they have right now on their ecosystem, we are seeing them having to loosen up a bit And maybe we get to a position where they do open up something like just-in-time compiling or JIT in the future. And then, to me, the floodgates would open a bit when it comes to GameCube, PS2, Dreamcast, even 3DS. Although the thing I will give a lot of these developers credit for these different emulators, they're trying to figure out workarounds because they understand there's a pretty large market there when it comes to iOS with all the iPhones and iPads out there. I understand the Apple TV 4K is more of a niche market. People buy it thinking I'm going to have a streaming box, and it's very good at that. But it's also shockingly good at times at emulating some of these games, even at higher resolutions and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't recommend going out and getting one of these just outright currently to play these different emulators. But if we get to a point where they do open up to something like JIT and GameCube and PS2 games are running well on it, I think there might be a bit more of a compelling recommendation there at the roughly $100 to $150 mark, depending on some of the sales going on. But let me know what you guys think about this down below, especially if you have an Apple TV or an Apple TV 4K. Have you tried out some of these emulators, and what do you think about them so far? Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.